Hello there, I'm Alex, and I sell cheese for a living. As a cheesemonger and certified cheese professional, I've helped thousands of customers find their favorite cheese. Each week, I'll share what I've learned from behind the counter as we dive into the vast, fascinating world of all things cheese. This week, we look at what happens when humans get involved with dairy. We are going to talk about a few cheese inventors, a couple cheese makers, some authors and educators, and basically cheese advocates in general. On this show, we talk about cheese a lot, but I don't usually talk about how it even exists. Like, I will usually say, humans needed to find a way to make milk last longer, but the actual act of creating those cheeses, that's going to be kind of what today's about. Some people just act like cheese grew out of the ground one day, fully aged, perfectly wrapped, and with a name you've probably heard your whole life. So you usually don't question how it got there or who made it. But cheese doesn't just come from nowhere, usually. Sometimes you leave your baby's bottle of milk in the sink a little too long and you find some nice curds waiting for you. But that's a different story. Every cheese you've eaten exists because someone made a choice. Sometimes that choice was deliberate. Sometimes it was an accident. Sometimes it was just a person saying, hey, what if we tried this instead? Basically, what we're talking about are the people behind the cheeses, not just the places, the terroir, not just traditions or folklore, but actual humans doing the most with the milk. And right up front, I'm going to say this. True cheese inventors are kind of rare and were sort of hard to find steadfast, factual evidence of them. Most cheeses evolved slowly over centuries, but there are a few cases where we can point to a person and say with some confidence, yeah, without them, this cheese probably wouldn't exist in the form we know today. Before we start naming names, I'm going to define a couple terms because cheese history loves to blur them. There are a few different ways someone can become tied to a cheese. If you were to invent an entirely new process of cheese making, depending on when you heat the milk, if you heat the milk, do you wash the curds? Do you not wash the curds? How long do you age it? Do you eat it right away? Those are all things part of the cheese making process that at any point, if you change something or tweak it just a little bit, it can create an entirely different beast. And some people would be tied to refining or standardizing an already existing style of cheese. If you grew up in your village back in the 1700s and there was a local cheese that you really loved and you wanted to learn how to make it and you started making it, but you realized you love salt and you poured twice as much salt into that cheese, your outcome would be a different cheese. And depending on its popularity, that might have become a new way of making that specific cheese. If you were someone who was in charge of naming or branding, or even popularizing a specific regional cheese. These people can do a lot of work. If you go find a product that you love, but it isn't very recognizable, but you are a wicked good marketer, you can also have your name associated with some types of cheeses. Or more likely is being the first person to document what was already happening. If, again, I go back to this person in a village making cheese that they have eaten their whole life, and they may be the first person who's ever wrote down what the recipe was. It's possible that there was just a passed down amount of ingredients and time and preparation that throughout history in this village, they could have all made the same cheese depending on those specific instructions passed down person to person. But if you were the first person to write it down, it would be exactly the same every time. That is innovation in a way of consistency. You aren't guessing or second guessing yourself. Did my uncle tell me 8 gallons or 8.5 gallons? Because you would know, you would have it written down and you could then use that recipe for every single batch of cheese you made thereafter. And with cheese and other similar foods, documentation matters almost as much as the creativity to create the cheese itself. If you didn't write it down, if you didn't teach it, or if you didn't scale it, history might have forgotten about you. Even if it was brilliant, it is extremely possible that there is a better than cheddar somewhere lost to history because someone didn't take the time to write down or pass down their knowledge. So as we go through these examples, I'm going to try to flag where the evidence is strong and where we're probably just dealing with a really good story. Let's talk about some of the strongest cases for cheeses with clear creators. First up, we're going to go with cheddar and Joseph Harding. Around England in the 1800s, Joseph Harding was making cheese, and cheddar existed before him, but modern cheddar absolutely would not exist without him. Harding is often called the father of modern cheddar, and that title is well earned because in the mid 1800s, he introduced controlled milk temperatures, standardized curd cutting, he improved sanitation, and the consistent aging practices. Before Harding, cheddar varied widely from farm to farm. And after Harding, cheddar became something that could be replicated and exported. This is a perfect example of process invention. He didn't create the flavor from scratch, but he took the recipe and he created a system that allowed that flavor to survive. And once you can replicate something, that's usually when it spreads. When you can make the same product over and over and over again, your chances of wide success greatly increase. This next one's a little interesting. It's Havarti and Han Nielsen from Denmark in the late 1800s. I actually heard this story first in a podcast about cheese a few years ago, and I thought it was really interesting that this cheese was invented by a woman who was a Danish farmer, and she basically ran the business of her farm. She did a lot of work with selling butter and milk around her area. I know when she was around 19 years old, she lived in a home named Havartigard. I wonder where she got Havarti from, but she went around Europe and she learned how to make a lot of interesting different cheese styles. And at one point, she worked with Joseph Harding in England, the guy we just talked about with cheddar. And she even learned how to make Brie and Roquefort and Gouda along with Edam from the Netherlands. There is a lot more interesting information about this woman that I think we can get into more in a future episode based purely on the creation of specific cheeses. So when we get to the Havarti episode, she will have a much larger piece of that show. But for right now, we're going to keep it short and sweet. After extensively crossing Europe and studying the cheese making techniques that were available, she returned to Denmark, where she deliberately combined elements of several different styles to create a semi-soft washed curd cheese suited to Danish milk, climate, and tastes. Her work was documented, it was taught, and it was disseminated through agricultural education. This part's not the legend. It is one of the strongest examples we have of clearly identified cheese inventor, even though she may have taken inspiration from many other pre-existing cheeses. Havarti is cheese as an intentional design, and Ms. Nielsen deserves far more recognition than she usually gets. If we were to look at Colby cheese and Joseph F. Steinwand, from Wisconsin in about the 1885 era. Colby is one of the rare cheeses we can confidently say was invented in the United States. Joseph Steinwand wasn't trying to make history, he was trying to make a milder, faster aging alternative to cheddar. And by washing the curds with cold water, he reduced the acidity and the moisture loss, creating a softer, more gentle cheese that could be sold sooner. We know who made it, we know where it happened, and we know roughly when. That level of specificity is unusual in cheese history. And I think it's because it's fairly recent. 1885 is not that long ago in terms of the entire history of cheese making. If we were to jump up a little bit to the early 1900s, we could look at processed cheese and James L. Kraft in the United States. Because no matter how you feel about processed cheese, James Kraft belongs in this conversation. He patented a method of heat treating cheese with emulsifying salts to prevent separation and spoilage. And that's not folklore. That was industrial food science. Processed cheese, it just traveled better. It lasted longer, it fed many soldiers, and it ended up in a lot of school lunches. It permanently changed how Americans interacted with cheese. And this is one of the clearest examples of a single person reshaping cheese culture at scale. Love it or hate it, we are all living in a world influenced by Kraft. We're going to move on to a different category of named cheeses with partial or contested creators. These cheeses are traditionally tied to individuals, but the evidence is messier, and that mess is part of the story. Camembert and Marie Harel, France from the late 1700s. Marie Harel was a real person. She was a farmer in Normandy, and she's often credited with inventing Camembert, although sometimes with the help of a priest hiding during the French Revolution. And here's where the complication lies. Soft ripened cheeses already existed in the region. What Marie Harel likely did was refine, popularize, or preserve a specific version that later became iconic. So did she invent Camembert? Maybe not from nothing. But without her, and without the story, Camembert probably doesn't become the national symbol it is today. This is a great example of how myth, identity, and cheese intertwine. If we were to look at Monterey Jack and David Jacks from California in the 1800s, Monterey Jack existed before David Jacks. Originally, is queso del pie. What Jack did was he commercialized it. He scaled production, sold it widely, and attached his name to it. So is that an invention? Not necessarily. I think that's more of a very specific rebranding, because once a cheese has a name, a market, and consistency, its identity kind of changes permanently. We can move on to monasteries as collective inventors. Some of the most important cheeses in history don't have a single creator. They have institutions. Monasteries kept records. They experimented. They taught. Monasteries are responsible for some of the best cheese, meat, wine, beer, foods in general in the entire collection of human history. And I think it's because they are so good at keeping their records and making sure everything they did was documented to ensure that what they did the next time was either the exact same if they wanted it or slightly different if they wanted that. Some popular cheeses they've created is Munster, Port Salut, and other Trappist-style cheeses. These cheeses exist in their modern forms largely because monks documented what worked. Some people can think of monasteries as early research labs, just with cows. Outside of the 1800s and the 1900s, we can look at some modern cheese inventors and producers, and these are not necessarily just revivals. These are people who either created new cheeses outright or reshaped how American and global audiences understand cheese. And I do believe I'm going to be looking at mostly American cheesemakers right now. Another episode will touch on all the other specific cheesemakers of different countries. These are kind of going to be the hits. If you are already a cheese person and you've been studying this for a while, or you just really love cheese, some of these names are probably going to sound familiar. And that's just because they are the hits. That if this show is showing you these names for the first time, these are excellent names to look into, excellent cheeses to try. We're going to look at the cellars at Jasper Hill in Vermont. Mateo Keller, Andy Keller fundamentally changed how American farmstead cheese could be aged, supported, and distributed. The cellars aren't just an aging facility, it's a complete infrastructure. Cheeses like Harbison exist because this system exists, and this is invention at an ecosystem level. If we were to go to California and look at Cypress Grove, we could talk about Mary Keene. I had the good fortune of meeting Mary this last year at the American Cheese Society conference. It was a 20-second conversation. I stopped her. I said, "Thank you for everything you've done for cheese, and, congratulations on your retirement." She was a wonderful woman to talk to. It was very nice. 20-30-second interaction. But Mary Keene helped introduce American consumers to fresh goat cheese long before it was trendy. Cypress Grove's chefs didn't just sell, they normalized goat cheese as everyday food. That cultural shift matters as much as the cheese itself. Mary and Cypress Grove will probably get an entire episode dedicated to them at some point. Actually, almost everything we've talked about in this episode is probably going to get a whole episode dedicated to them at some point. This is just a quick overview. If something were to sound good for you, you could go look them up in the meantime until those episodes come. But pretty much every name, every cheese in this episode will at some point get an entire episode dedicated to them, because everyone on this list is just so incredibly important and fascinating. Back to the people who've changed cheese. Laura Chanel from California. Laura Chanel is one of the most influential figures in American goat cheese history. Her cheeses appeared in restaurants, and it helped legitimize American Chev nationally. Without her, the American goat cheese movement would look very different. Another leading woman of the cheese industry, Allison Hooper from Vermont Creamery. Allison Hooper played a massive role in introducing French-style fresh cheeses to American kitchens. Creme fraiche, fromage blanc, cultured butter, these became accessible because of her work. She didn't just sell cheese, she sold very high-end technique of cooking. Over in Wisconsin, we could look at Pleasant Ridge Reserve and Andy Hatch. Pleasant Ridge Reserve wasn't an accident. Andy Hatch designed it intentionally, embracing seasonal milk variation rather than fighting it. The result is a cheese that changes subtly throughout the year, but remains unmistakably itself. This is modern invention. Clear creator, clear philosophy, clear documentation, and international recognition to match. All of the people we talked about for modern American heroes of cheese and cheese making all had a very common goal in mind: to make something extraordinary from something quite common, just milk. plain milk, goat's milk or cows, it doesn't matter. Milk chemistry limits how wild you can get, but these innovators, found a way to make amazing products. Most breakthroughs in cheeses are incremental. You have small process tweaks, change how you age it, use different versions or cleaner milk. And then for distribution, it can always be a little smarter, a little more cutting edge. And that's why so many cheeses have evolved rather than just appeared. Cheese rewards patience more than disruption. Past the cheese inventors, the cheese creators, the cheese makers, another big section of the cheese world of people who influence it every day are going to be the authors, educators, and the cheese communicators. Cheese culture doesn't survive with cheese wheels alone. It survives because people explain it, contextualize it, and advocate for it. One of the biggest names in cheese that I remember reading about when I first got into the game was Anne Saxelby. She was the founder of Saxelby Cheesemongers and an author of The New Rules of Cheese. Anne Saxelby reframed how Americans talked about cheese. She centered producers over prestige, emphasized tasting over intimidation, and treated American cheese as something worthy of pride rather than apology. Anne was one of the loudest early voices insisting that American cheese needed better storytelling. Liz Thorpe is a fun person to talk about. She's all over the internet. If you have ever YouTubed the word cheese, it's very possible you have seen her name pop up. She's an author of the Cheese Chronicles, founder of the People's Cheddar, and Liz has helped professionalize cheese education in the US while still keeping it human. She's particularly important for connecting mongers, consumers, and producers, and a network between the three. One of my personal favorite authors, Paul Kinstedt, I think the first book of his I read was Cheese and Culture, which talks about the background of food history and cheese history in general, of how it came to be and how it was impacted by the world and humans evolving along with the food. He was a co-founder of the Vermont Institute for Artisan Cheese, and Paul Kinstedt bridged academic dairy science and practical cheese making. His work explains why cheese behaves the way it does, which has influenced an entire generation of American cheesemakers and cheesemongers, much like myself. One of the most popular books on cheese would be The Oxford Companion to Cheese, written by Catherine Donnelly. This book is a beast, and it has damn near everything in it you would ever need to know about cheese if you're just getting started. This book fundamentally changed how cheese was treated as a subject. It positioned cheese alongside wine, art, and literature as something worthy of rigorous reference and scholarship. If you are a cheesemaker or cheesemonger in America, you probably know the name Nathan Aldridge. He is one of the largest names for education and cheese advocacy in the country, and he has talked about what it takes to go beyond making cheese and how to make it a more commonplace food talked about in every home. He's an advocate for artisan standards. He teaches education around fresh and cultured dairy, and he works on bridging professionalism with consumer cheese language. Much of modern American cheese fluency, the terms, expectations, categories, exist because educators like him insist that cheese deserves a clearer vocabulary. And on a personal note, I've attended a few classes from Nathan, and he helped do some Zoom meeting preparation for the ACS CCP exam. So huge shout out to Nathan. I don't know if I would have been able to pass that exam without him and all of his cheesy knowledge. Another cheese maker and cheese advocate is going to be Marieke Penterman from Marieke Gouda. She's the founder and head cheesemaker of Marieke Gouda and one of the most decorated American cheesemakers internationally. Marieke represents a rare case of European tradition fully rerouted in American soil. Trained in the Netherlands and producing Gouda-style cheeses on her own Wisconsin farm, Marieke proved that milk quality, technique, and commitment mattered more than geography alone. Fun fact here, Marieke has won multiple top honors at international competitions, forcing European judges to take American Gouda seriously. And another side note here, I have met Marieke a handful of times. She is an extraordinary person to talk to. Pat Ford and Tim Welsh are longtime educators, judges, and advocates within the American artisan cheese world. They have influential voices that help shape professional standards and evaluation. As well as incredible cheese makers, Ford and Welsh helped define what quality means in modern American cheese. Much of what counts as competition-ready or professionally excellent cheese is shaped by people like this, not necessarily the consumers. In closing, most cheeses weren't invented, at least how we eat them today. They arrived there. The cheeses we remember and the people we remember are the ones who documented, taught, protected, and shaped what they were doing. Cheese history doesn't just reward creativity, it rewards the people who told the story. Every time you eat a piece of cheese, you are tasting someone's decisions from thousands or hundreds or dozens of years ago. If I'm being completely honest, this was kind of a hard episode to make. There are too many names in the cheese world that need a light to shine on them and show off all the wonderful things they do for this category of food. I tried to pick some of the top names or the hot topic names that would seem culturally significant for the time, but there are dozens, if not hundreds more that should have been included here. Just for editing on time, it was a little tricky. I said previously, every name in this episode will eventually get an entire episode dedicated just to them, and I feel like that will end up being a mini series between the Cheese Maker series, the Cheese Monger series, the Author series, the Inventors series, and etc. So if I didn't get to your favorite cheese maker today, keep listening. It will come. And if it doesn't come in the time that you want it to, leave a comment on Facebook or YouTube and let me know which cheese maker or which cheese in general you want to hear me talk about. This episode that included inventors, authors, farmers, educators, producers, and advocates is brought to you because cheese doesn't survive on milk alone. It survives on people who argue about it, document it, defend it, and make room for it in the culture. Every wheel of cheese represents a set of decisions, simple ones like what milk to use, trickier ones like what traditions to follow and what rules to break. And when you taste a cheese, you're tasting those decisions, whether you know the name behind them or not. Who made this cheese possible is an endlessly fun question to ask. And who made sure it didn't disappear is just as fun, if not a little harder to find the answer. Thank you for listening. My name is Alex. This has been The Modern Monger.